please, to the extent that you can, share this information with friends and family. Demystify our election system as much as possible. The amount of ads and the amount of propaganda is intended to terrify you, to make you feel small, to make you feel like you don't have any power. This is a bunch of rich people and their dumb games. We can defeat that.
Welcome back to Cream City Social, everybody, and we are here for part 3 of our 3-part series on how elections are an industry in this country with our good friend Eric Rorholm. This last one answers the question of what do we do now that we know that big money is in our politics. We know how it got there, Citizens United in 2010 Supreme Court case. Now that it's in and we see what it's doing, where it's going in the super PACs, how it's influencing our elections, what do we do about it? And Eric has the answers for you. So stay tuned till the end of the episode and you'll walk away with a couple tidbits of what you can do in your daily life to save your brain and help ultimately save this system, this country, this democracy. Everyone that we know and love is in it. Let's keep it together. All right, with that, a little bit of announcement for Sam and Missy's campaigns. They both got the signatures they need, so they will both be on the ballot come April. Now we've got the signatures on, there's going to be a big push for actually knocking on doors and trying to get people to vote for these candidates. So come out now that we're on the ballot. The real work gets to begin, and I cannot wait. I'm looking outside and it's snowing a little bit, so we'll have hand warmers, hats, gloves, all the things that you need. Stay warm as we canvass this city. And with that, here is the third part of a very honest conversation with someone making positive change in Milwaukee. So Eric, what do we do? What does this counter-revolution look like?
Well, so that's a really good question, and I love the way that you phrased it, because the third section I've got here is sort of counter-revolution. And that was funny language for me because I'm working for our Wisconsin Revolution now, and Bernie talked a lot about the political revolution when he was campaigning. And counter-revolution is a really good way to describe what both parties, but I would argue really the Democratic Party, are doing now with their newfound power. Actually, the ban on consultants that had helped progressive challengers, and it was only progressive challengers, by the way, that was a really early example of how they were starting to flex their muscles of big money a little bit. There's another piece here. This is from a piece in Jacobin, I believe. The Democratic Party's leadership is trying to destroy progressives. This is also by David Sirota. I'm going to read just a little bit of this real quick, just to kind of describe what the circumstance is today.
I was just going to say, what's the lay of the land today?
Yeah, because things have changed a little bit, both in terms of the party institutions and in terms of the super PACs. There have been some new developments in the last couple of years that have really reshaped the race. So here from this Jacobin article, David Sirota says, in all, more than a dozen consulting firms that have worked directly for either Democratic Party committees or President Joe Biden's political apparatus have been paid more than $12 million by the allegedly independent super PACs now buying primary elections for corporate candidates. This article came out in May, so that was him saying that the party has literally spent at that point, institutions had spent $12 million to firms that were formally tied to the party or Joe Biden directly. Among those firms is SKDK, one of my very favorites, led by Biden White House senior advisor Anita Dunn. Anita Dunn represented Harvey Weinstein through, right. So when you hear Republicans talking about Harvey Weinstein and stuff, this is why. Anita Dunn still is extremely close to both Jen Psaki and Joe Biden. So that's where that comes from. So Anita Dunn and Waterfront Strategies, an affiliate of the Democratic media buying firm GMMB that works with super PACs for both House and Senate Democrats.
Super PACs.
One of the committees is run by longtime Democratic pollster Mark Mellman, who has advised the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, which elects House Democrats, as well as corporate clients in the health insurance and pharmaceutical centers. Ooh, there's another really good one.
Corporate clients.
Yeah. So, this is another really fabulous example is these institutions of big money will hire their friends.
Yeah.
And their friends are also consulting for, like, in this specific example, a health insurance client and a pharmaceutical corporation client. So you tell me, do you think that this consultant...
Yeah, hey, wait a minute.
Let me tell you what's happened. A bunch of people have paid the DCCC. It's run by Congressman Sean Patrick Maloney, also gay, fun fact, in New York. And Sean Patrick Maloney has, because a lot of smart people around him have told him, Sean Patrick Maloney has hired the same people who have been doing this forever. So he's hired this firm that is this consultant who also is representing health insurance and pharmaceutical corporations. And he's sitting across the table from this consultant and he goes, hey, what should we campaign on, Mr. Consultant? Should we campaign on lowering healthcare costs and making pharmaceuticals more affordable? Mm-hmm. Should we? And what would the person on the other end of the table who's being paid
whose
raise
paychecks
health
are paid for by this company?
Right. The corruption is so direct and transparent.
I was gonna say transparent. Like,
yes,
he's being paid by them.
This is just what's on paper. This is just what's transparent just in this article.
It's just the trail.
So here's some examples. The first few months of 2022 tell the story of the leadership-sanctioned crusade to snuff out the progressive movement. Yes, I want to clarify, when the DCCC endorses candidates and particularly endorses against progressive candidates, they are not doing so just neutrally because they're like, oh, gee, we should win. These are directed political, often personal decisions made by political personal actors. The reason I highlight Sean Patrick Maloney is earlier this year, Democrats tried to gerrymander New York State. Failed, it backfired. They got a bunch of competitive seats in New York City they didn't want. Sean Patrick Maloney, even though he's the chair of the DCCC and his job is literally to make sure Democrats are competitive, he literally fled his own congressional district because he thought it would be too competitive, moved to a safer district that he is also now on the verge of losing, by the way. He has made 2 districts now from lean Democrat to competitive. He strong-armed another queer progressive out of that seat named Mondaire Jones, bullied him into moving from suburban New York to Brooklyn to run for Congress.
Oh.
And then he lost to Levi Strauss. I don't think he's technically a billionaire. I think he's just worth 9 digits. Dan Goldman,
genes.
Who will now be the congressman from that district. And Sean Patrick Maloney is on track to lose that first district to a Republican. So
what he's selling is really being picked up. People
like
it. Uh-huh.
So here's some examples. In Oregon's newly drawn 5th congressional district, Biden defied local Democratic county organizations and endorsed incumbent Representative Kurt Schrader over his progressive challenger, Jamie McLeod Skinner. Kurt Schrader was one of the Democrats who in Congress specifically went out of his way to destroy the Build Back Better Act and lobby against Joe Biden's priorities. So I want to say this again. Biden, in multiple circumstances, went out of his way to endorse candidates who themselves went out of their way to protest Biden in Congress. So this is, I will say it a third time, when the Build Back Better Act was being put together, and it was a lot of Democrats in both the House and the Senate, by the way, that privately made scenes in committee. All the ones who made scenes in committee, Joe Biden went out of his way to support, including this one. So the D-Trip supported this candidate who, well, because because these candidates are completely transparently doing the bidding of big money. And this is the problem, was that Joe Biden was pushed into making a lot of promises he clearly had no intention of ever fulfilling. And then, shocker, Americans wanted a lot of that to be fulfilled. And so this is where you see hand-wringing around a lot of particular issues. And there are names that I can
He doesn't really
name later,
need their support. He doesn't really care if they pass or not pass.
So this is an example. Kurt Schrader was one of the biggest Democrats, literally fighting the Democratic agenda and still mind-bendingly. So this, I would argue, was one of the reasons Democrats are struggling right now. And yet the DCCC, whose job is to help elect more Democrats, has gone in to try and protect this candidate who's making their lives worse. That's one example. Also in Oregon, House Democrat Super PAC has spent $1 million for Carrick Flynn, who the Oregonian notes is an electoral novice who's barely participated in Oregon's civic life, supporting him over progressive state rep Andriana Salinas. The move appears to be designed to integrate House Democrats with cryptocurrency billionaire Sam Bankman-Fried, top Biden donor who is bankrolling a separate super PAC. We'll talk about him again in a second because that comes up relevant again in another really big district. In Ohio, Biden and House Majority Whip Jim Clyburn intervened. You might have heard of this one. Intervened to secure the election for corporate-friendly Democrat Shontel Brown against Nina Turner in Ohio's. No, I'm not going to remember which race it was. This was a really, really, really high-profile one. Nina Turner was one of Bernie's most significant national surrogates. She would have been,
I would argue, her from.
Sorry?
That's what I remember her from.
Yeah, I would argue she would have been probably the most progressive member of the House. She has been resoundingly crushed by big money twice. We'll talk about that race, though, a little bit more because there's some more funkiness going on right now.
And so all of this is examples of big money being used to drown out progressives right now.
Yeah, and there's a ton. I mean, there's one in North Carolina. There's another in Pennsylvania. I mean, there's one in Texas. Cuellar, who was an anti-abortion Democrat, who not only the D-Trip went and campaigned, who not only the D-Trip endorsed, this Democrat who was against abortion and against the PRO Act, so anti-union. Not only did the DCCC endorse him, Pelosi herself made phone calls and recorded a robocall into the district, and he narrowly made it out ahead. So this institution is literally out there campaigning for anti-abortion Democrats, anti-labor Democrats, anti-Biden, people who are campaigning for the platform that they say they support are the candidates who are being spent against by the party. It's mind-numbing.
And so what's the thought there? Because I keep hearing that too, that they're spending money on radical Republicans because they think
that's another example. I didn't even bring that one up, but that's
this is totally divorced. But what?
Nope, it's
what
the same.
What the frick is going on?
No, it's the exact same. So that's another really fabulous example. Thank you for bringing that up because that's another ridiculous waste of money. So this is and again,
like a breakdown of the world.
So many issues coalesce here. This is the same institution. The DCCC made a calculation that in a number of districts, they thought that in a number of districts in which a anti-election, an election denying Trump supporter was running to primary a quote traditional Republican in 10 seats, I believe, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee spent money on ads against those candidates, but not against those normal Republicans, not in terms of, I've got to think of a specific example. I can't do this theoretically because the reason I bring this up, there were 10 Republicans who voted to impeach Donald Trump in 2021. 8 of those 10 are retiring. 2 of them were still going to be around. So there was already going to be a very small, if at all, caucus of semi-reasonable Republicans in the Democrats' mind. Most of those are already retiring or were defeated. Liz Cheney was defeated. Jamie Herrera Butler of Washington retired. Adam Kinzinger retired. Peter Meyer, that, by the way, Meyer of the grocery store Meyer. Same Meyer. It is the same Meyer. It is the grocery store mogul Meyer. Peter Meyer, because of course it is. Representative Peter Meyer of Michigan, won his election in 2020. He was one of those people who voted to impeach Donald Trump, and Michigan has an independent redistricting commission, so his district really got redrawn, and it was pretty competitive. He is being primaried by... this is important context. It's partisan, kind of even. I think Republicans have an advantage. He's being primaried by a MAGA-ish Republican. Democrats ran ads on TV being like, Peter Meyer not tough enough on the Second Amendment, and essentially running Trumpy ads designed to radicalize Republicans, and they were successful. They defeated Peter Meyer. Oh. Yes, they worked. So you have a number of districts now where, think of the absurdity of this, where the Democratic Party's apparatuses have spent money boosting far-right Republicans, have spent money defeating the kinds of Republicans they say they support to help far-right Republicans win in the primary in the fingers crossed hope that is based on nothing, on the vibes that hopefully that'll help Democrats win. And that
win in
thinking,
the next election.
Right, and that thinking is predicated, again, it goes back to the 2006 Rahm Emanuel version of what a moderate winnable candidate is, which was only true in 2006. So we are using a almost 2-decade-old model of politics to burn money, I would argue. Just waste it. Successfully primarying out Republicans who maybe under some circumstances would vote with a Democratic minority if it had enough power left over. Yeah, it is a very real problem. And the fact that they have been successful should give us a lot of pause, because this...
That's what I was going to say. They're going to keep doing it. It worked. So
the
Democratic dollars
trend,
will go there.
Well, and think of the absurdity of this, that super PAC money can like shape voting behavior on both sides. Is like really, really, really chilling.
Because both sides are connected and react to one another?
It says we as Americans have just like no real control over our two-party system almost at this point anymore. I mean, the DCCC is spending to intervene in the Republican primary, and then there's so much money swirling around that it's as if these political parties are 0% beholden to us, essentially.
That's what I'm taking from this conversation.
Yeah. And so there's one more bit of funky fun that comes
spooky
this
fun?
year. Spooky.
We'll keep the theme going.
Yeah. I'm deciding whether or not I want to talk about Kyrsten Sinema. I think I don't want to talk about Kyrsten Sinema because that can be its own nightmare. Kyrsten Sinema to me is really interesting because she represents the corruption on the lobbying side so much, so well. Like, I mean, trust me, the people that she's taking money from are the issue, but she is so pressurable, like as a senator, not as a candidate, that's really where I'm focused on, like Sinema's interest. But
so you can see it, like you can trace the money back to her donations.
Well, in the meetings,
her.
Oh yeah, hedge funds and pharma in particular. That's why she's been such a pain in the rear when it comes to taxes and Medicare negotiating drug prices. Is she's just like explicitly meeting with hedge fund managers and pharma, like literally explicitly.
Do they have to report those meetings, or is that found out by like journalists and staff? And
they do have to report those meetings. And the filings for a lot of that is really, really interesting. And the more, I highly encourage people to just look at some of these random ones, because I do not even think people understand the extent to the corruption that pervades every instance of their lives. Everything ties back to big money or these like corrupt people in some way. I cannot even express to you the extent to which that is true. But the reason I bring that up is that she's just a really good example of how big money like can really fundamentally shape the way that people are voting. And I think the way that I'm going to close this out is by talking about the next greatest threat and the new orientation into how this super PAC money is going. And there are a couple of races that exemplify this really, really well. The Nina Turner Chantel Brown race is a really, really good proxy of this, what I'm about to talk about. The Marie Newman versus Sean Casten race. I guess there's 4. That was in Illinois suburbs and a little bit of Chicago, as well as Andy Levin and Haley Stevens' primary for a competitive House seat, and then Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib. All 5 of those races, Democratic primaries in particular, had one big thing in common, and it was unprecedented spending from Israel-aligned super PACs, which has been interesting. In general, I am very fascinated by the politics of this issue overall, and I would count on its relevance continuing, especially, this is going to sound like a side note, but especially like with the Republican orientation towards Israel clashing with the Republican anti-Semitism problem, as exemplified by Kanye and his tweeting. And you see a kind of a similar fight happening between the pro-Palestinian members of Congress, the few of which there are, and the Zionist members of the Democratic caucus. which is that Israel politics are very complicated now in both parties. But what's interesting, this kind of started to bubble up in 2019 in the 116th Congress when you had Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib elected, and the whole squad was pretty vocal about Palestinian issues at that point. It really kind of helped to open the door. There was a little bit more of it in this last Congress. Candidates who immediately got viciously lashed out about for speaking about this issue, and so much as signing letters and saying that the Palestinians deserved self-determination was enough to get these candidates borderline declared war against them, I would argue.
And so then they get primary the next time around. Is that the repercussions for that?
So there were a lot of super PACs that got involved in competitive Democratic races where this was an issue, but not all. And what else is interesting is, so there were two main ones. Democratic Majority for Israel was a big one, and then AIPAC, also the American Israeli Political Action Committee, is what that stands for. They have a super PAC now too, the name of which I'm not sure. They've gotten involved in a lot of races. Some where the Israel-Palestine issue is huge, and some where it's not. Because the interesting thing is these groups are not just taking money from Israeli interested, like groups interested in the Israel-Palestine oppression. These are all kinds of groups and corporations that we understand, because this is a super PAC, have been giving. And they also don't necessarily run ads on Israel-Palestine. For example, DMFI, I believe, Democrat Majority for Israel, and I might be wrong if this was the specific super PAC behind this ad, but there was an ad that ran in Chantel Brown, Nina Turner's race that falsely claimed Nina Turner didn't support the $15 minimum wage. They quoted something where she was like, $15 is not enough. Nina Turner obviously supports a living wage, if anybody knows her. But they twisted around the issue of the $15 minimum wage to make a progressive look conservative. Same with, they also clipped her saying that voting for Joe Biden was like eating half a bowl of shit, and then which was funny.
That's pretty
and
funny.
then turns that into a super PAC ad too, right? But they drowned the airwaves, in really hateful messaging. They did similar stuff to Nina Turner. Oh, Cori Bush is another example where they're doing this. They do a lot of the same tactics, by the way, that that super PACs have been doing to Mandela Barnes, like, and black candidates forever, like with the darkening of the skin and like the radical sounding rhetoric, and really engaging like Republicans. And the reason I say that is because another race where this was relevant was a swing seat in Michigan, where you had Andy Levin, who himself was Jewish, running against Haley Stevens, who was getting a ton of money spent on her behalf by these same groups, DMFI and these pro-Israel groups, some of which was messaging about Israel and about how Andy Levin like doesn't believe Israel has a right to exist and wants, whatever the horrible, scary messaging is in that district. But they also run misleading ads about the issues. And so some of these institutions are really clever and have figured out how to tap into relevant issues to the end that they are sabotaging candidates. And we're now at a phase where these super PACs like DMFI are using their status as an Israel-aligned group sort of as defense to still take all the money from the same normal players and still campaign on the same stuff, but to say, oh no, we're fighting anti-Semitism. It's almost got like an identity politics like cloak around it at this point too. But that's a real divergence, which is that you not only have super PACs that are we are at a point where super PACs have essentially, I would argue, like bought our election industry, have turned it into an industry, but we're now at a point where these super PACs are ideologically trying to shape both parties and in very specific targeted ways like that.
And at the national and local level, right? So they're doing this nationally all over, but they're doing it in specific local races. Like we're seeing it with Mandela Barnes. And so every place kind of sees this influence, right?
The
It's
Israel
not just New
groups
York
are
and
not
LA.
advertising in this race, but for another example, they did blanket Minneapolis in airwaves against
Okay.
Ilhan Omar, and she came within a point of losing her primary when she was projected to win it by a lot. So the money actually is started, unlike at the partisan level when it's Republicans versus Democrats. This money is starting to be really effective at crushing progressive candidates in primaries. The other problem with
both
that,
sides will spend money against him.
both sides will spend money,
Any progressive, yeah.
and then. And the ultimate problem that is here is the candidates that they're defeating, I would argue, and most would, are the candidates that are more likely to win anyway. So not only do you have the parties being shaped ideologically by this big money in the primary process,
They're self-selecting.
right? So then you have the Democratic small d component of the primary where you're choosing your candidate. That process has now been sort of taken from us and propagandized by big money. But then they also are doing the same amount of spending in the general too. So it's, I guess the big transition sort of has been from this amount of partisan spending in the general to trying preemptively to shape what these races look like.
By nonpartisan, so like not the DCCC or
No,
Republicans.
excuse me.
It's
These
just by super PACs.
these partisan institutions are trying to affect partisan primaries. That's what I'm saying. So instead of just focusing on generals, they're now actively trying to select candidates in primaries and have them win, and then use those to set a narrative, to spend a bunch of money against Nina Turner over the $15 minimum wage, and then be able to come out and say, and this proves that Cleveland loves Israel and we cannot possibly threaten the Iron Dome spending. That is the way that the money pipeline works. And then that money and then that threat is then used to, I would argue, what part of why they blanketed Nina Turner's race the second time is they wanted to make an example of her. They wanted to terrify and make it very clear, if you try to come up against this party's status quo, no matter whether you are a woman, no matter whether you are a person of color, no matter whether you are, whatever, that party will come out and advertise against you and make you look like crap to your neighbors and do everything possible to defeat you.
Beat the shit out of you.
Yeah, I would argue. So this article that I'm pulling from is called Primary Occupation, which I actually think is hilarious and a great play on words. Primary occupation, Israel occupation, like primaries.
Hey, yeah.
It's their primary. It's very funny. It's
That's heady.
but it's a really good article that kind of lays out the nuts and bolts. So where does that leave us now, I guess?
Yes.
At the end of the day, I hope that was all a very informative kind of interactive living history, like the way that big money has sort of metastasized since the Citizens United decision, and really defining terms like that to kind of demystify the process, like to pull apart what is a PAC, what is a super PAC, what is a campaign committee, just a candidates committee, what's a coordinated committee, just when a couple committees like the state party and a candidate coordinate together. But yeah, underneath these seemingly simple words like super PAC is a whole lot of untraceable money that's doing the heavy lifting to take our democracy away from us.
Yes. And so we have traced it from how the big money got to be such a big player in 2010 and our Citizens United legislation getting passed, and how that opened the door to all this big money.
It was a Supreme Court case, to be clear.
Supreme Court case.
Yeah.
There we go. Good. I need a little fact checker. If you could help us
Well,
out.
I'm glad you said that, though, because that underscores the ridiculousness of it. A law wasn't passed that changed our election system, very similar to Roe v. Wade being overturned. It was the Supreme
That's even
Court.
more true, yeah.
The same way they kind of came in with a sledgehammer and
just brought up a case to it and then
just
decided
shattered our status quo. Yeah, it is a
change the
very similar dynamic.
fabric of society. Yeah.
So anyway, what were you saying?
Where all the money came from, how it got here, how it looks like, and what it looks like today.
Yep.
What can we do about this? Is this something that we can fight piecemeal on the ground each candidacy, each campaign? Or is this something that we really got to nip in the bud, figure out how to systematically change this? Is there a way to systematically change this?
Well, there is, in theory.
Yeah.
People say end dark money in elections a lot. That would do a lot. I believe you need a constitutional amendment to codify all of the ideal protections against dark money into the Constitution officially. There was a big collection of legislation designed to fight this I don't even remember what they called it now. At the beginning of this year, end of last, there was a big voting rights push in the Democratic caucus, I guess in the Democratic Party, that included alongside things like, gerrymandering reform, putting nonpartisan commissions to draw districts and stuff. It was a whole kind of grab bag of democracy reform items that died really for no real reason other than that you needed 50 votes on this legislation. And this is the insidiousness of the filibuster. Since we had the filibuster in the U.S. Senate, we had 50 Democrat U.S. senators, 51, including Vice President Harris. So you theoretically can pass it, but they have the filibuster and defend it rigorously. The Democrats set the rules of the Senate, but enough Democrat senators said we want to keep the filibuster, which means anything, with very few exceptions, needs 60 votes to pass. And so people like Sinema can say, no, I'm not breaking the filibuster. And that is sufficient context to explain why this will fail. So, yes, Congress can take action to do any number of things to roll back.
So a
dark
Democrat
money
or
spending.
Republican could do it, but the
Democrat
outlet
or Republican
looks
theoretically
like
could do it.
Neither of their interests align with doing that. They're feeding from that same trough, so they're not going to do it.
And think of the perverse incentives here with leadership. It's Pelosi and Steny Hoyer, the chair of the Democratic caucus, who are begging people to make their DCCC dues. It's leadership that's directing the spending of the money. And so leadership, once you reach a level in the caucus where you are able to have the power to advocate for campaign finance changes, you are deep enough in the system that you functionally cannot advocate for campaign finance changes. This is the eternal catch-22, is the entire apparatus is floated by big money. I cannot communicate the extent to which, if these people were cut off from the revolving door from big money firms, they would have nowhere to go. I do not believe Nancy Pelosi has poor friends. They have nothing but big money infrastructure. So legislation can be passed, I think it is really ignorant to just, and I'm glad you asked this question. I think it's really ignorant to just say we need to get a bill passed through Congress, because the problem is not just the law. The problem is the people in the Congress that are not passing that law. And there is great bipartisan consensus among voters about common sense democracy reform, whether that's in-person election day registration, whether that's nonpartisan redistricting, whether that's removing dark money from elections and ending super PACs, whether that's putting significant limitations on PAC spending. Like there are lots of things that can be done. The problem is this two-party system that's being fed by big money. So you can, in 2008, we elected 60 Democrats to the U.S. Senate. That was filibuster proof, We don't have single payer. You'll notice that a lot of things that were promised didn't happen. And so, yes, a bill could be passed on the floor of the U.S. Congress. There's a lot of work to be done to get a lot of big money politicians out of the Congress before there's room to move in Congress. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. That's my gut feel too, that this is like a mass movement 20 years from now. Everybody's on the streets. That's the only way that this could actually be accomplished.
Yeah, and it's remarkably bipartisan.
Systematically.
Yeah, to the extent that, there's so many things I didn't even talk about today. I talked about, today in terms of the Democratic side. The Republican side is, literal grift. I'm not kidding. Rick Scott, the chair of I'm legitimately not joking. Rick Scott, U.S. Senator Rick Scott from Florida, who, by the way, to this day is the biggest Medicare scammer we have record of. He was stealing so much from Medicare, so I have an idea. Let's put him in charge of our money. He is in charge of the NRSC, the National Republican Senatorial Committee. At first it was candidates complaining, particularly Blake Masters, but also Herschel Walker. They were like, the NRSC ads aren't really working. And then I feel like the NRSC isn't spending much money. And then it was, where is the NRSC money going to from candidates? And then all of a sudden the Justice Department was like, gee, this is looking real sketch. So Rick Scott is actively, and the NRSC is literally actively under investigation right now. And if Democrats, and,
like that money's
and let
not
me make
there.
this point very clear because I'm glad you asked about that. Part of the reason Democrats have a shot at keeping the Senate is because of that. Because the Republicans are so untrustworthy
stealing.
that they are mismanaging the money in their own super PACs. Yes, this I literally argue this is the reason that Herschel Walker and Dr. Oz are still in danger. Like that for no reason other than Rick Scott's griftiness are we maybe looking at the possibility of a Democrat Senate again. And I think that underscores the ridiculousness of the system in every way. Yeah. So there are things we can do. Yeah. I mean, as a democracy, there's legislation that can be changed. But I also want to highlight, my friends in the Green Party. There were a lot of things it was the For the People Act. That was it. And then it became the Freedom to Vote Act. There were things in there that people who are not a fan of the two-party system were very skeptical of in terms of limits that were raised in terms of how much parties could transfer between their state and federal campaigns, I think. The moral of the story is if you get any reforms out of this two-party system, it's going to be reforms that are accessible and acceptable within the big money-driven system. And you're not going to be able to defeat the big money system if you're playing with the candidates elected within it.
Is there anything an average listener can take away from this and actions in their life that can be better put towards not continuing this big money system?
Well, I mean, definitely. So, for example, there are a lot of telltale signs of when an ad is going to be a super PAC ad anyway. They'll say at the end, paid for by. If it's not paid for by the candidate, chances are it's paid for by a super PAC. And there are things that I encourage you to identify sort of like a game when you see a super PAC ad. If it's talking about negatively about the other candidate, probably a super PAC ad. If, that swelling music and if it's nice and vague, bonus points if it's about something that's like a big issue but not a huge issue, that's probably a super PAC ad. The reason I encourage people to almost like gamify it a little bit is the negativity is real. And like these super PAC ads are setting the tone of the election. And it's part of why I was kind of frustrated with the Barnes campaign when they made a whole statement about the racism of the Barnes or of the anti-Barnes ads, which were very racist, but in my opinion, that centered the tone of the super PAC ads and legitimized
set the narrative for it.
These horrible ads that have nothing to do with the things that we care about, or maybe they vaguely do. Like maybe it's a vague ad about abortion that you vaguely agree with or something. These ads are not made by normal people. They're not made for normal people. These things set the tone of our election, and it can make you feel like, oh my God, my neighbor actually thinks that, or like, oh my gosh, like someone, maybe you think of yourself as a progressive and you see an ad on TV that's supposed to be progressive and you hate the way something is said and you don't agree with that at all. And these ads are not representative of normal people. Like
Yes.
Normal people don't think like this. Normal people don't talk like this. Normal people don't act like this. You almost have to just kind of laugh at them because they are so just absolutely out of touch. And again, I'm going to use the industry word. Cable viewership is just so terrible right now. The extent to which cord cutters have really tanked like traditional television. I'm not saying that in a ridiculous way. To the extent of which it almost feels like cable TV is pretty much only propped up by advertising in the first place. So it's like these super PAC ads are some of the biggest income that a lot of these TV stations and stuff are going to have all year. And there are other ways this, there are rules that accidentally incentivize this. Super PACs have to pay more, for example, for the same airtime that campaigns do.
Oh, interesting.
That also means the station gets more money for running a super PAC ad then, doesn't it? Right. So, right. Interesting. You can bill them an exclusive rate. So, right. So, in general, the biggest thing I can say is these ads, other than that the ads from the candidates, don't take them seriously.
Don't take them seriously. Don't let them shape your brain and make you think that people are thinking this way.
Seriously, because they're so absolutely unrepresentative of the reality. And number two, I mean, this is part of why I encourage people to become members of DSA. I mean, there's no replacement for a democratic system other than a democratic system. Like the more your representatives hear from you, like real people in their offices hear from you, and there's real files of you reaching out, real, like, I know the internet is a limited tool, but politicians read that stuff, like real comments, real tweets, real organizing work, real pushback, real primarying of people. If you disagree with them, even if you lose, you can move people a lot on the issues and start a discussion that might never ever have been started. And so these ads are a little bit indicative of a system that is really closed to the 1%, but any person can run for office. And
I've seen that firsthand.
I've seen that firsthand, and there's no better check against a dysfunctional democracy than a democratic campaign.
And a regular human running for office.
Yeah, seriously.
Yes.
Well, and this is the insidiousness of the big money, is that it does really blow these things out of proportion. But fortunately, a lot of local and state races have still been spared from some of these like hideous amounts of money. And this is the ridiculousness of this system and our democracy, is like at the top of the ballot, the races are like this. At the bottom of the ballot, a lot of races are uncontested, or
I
like
know, that's
no
what
one
I keep seeing.
or like no one even runs. That's like very common in a lot of places too, that it's just the same person keeps anointing a successor and only one person files to run. So actually organizing to take the institutions of our democracy back piece by piece from big money and hold them tightly in working class hands, that to me is the number one thing that we can do to build an ironclad resistance against big money. Because when working class people have the control, you can spend as much money against us as you want. But if working class people have a common agenda and are organized to win these races, and we have the institution to do so, and we can defeat the money, we will be able to. As I've said, like, this is the big weakness of that system, is that they're terrible at this. Absolutely terrible.
They're incompetent.
Terrible. Incompetent. The ads suck.
They are
the digital ads suck. A lot of times the mailers suck. A lot of times the lit pieces suck. If you think it, you're not crazy. You're being legit. And it goes to why these local races are so important, because it's a talent incubator, it's a skills incubator, it's a democracy incubator, and ultimately these are some of the only institutions we really have left that are free of the influence of corporate money.
Let's win them all back, Eric.
Let's win them all back one by one. That's the goal, right?
Run it back. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming, Eric, and have you back again soon. Let's make this a quarterly thing or something.
Yeah, seriously. Thank you for having me. And thank you for everybody who is listening to this. Please, to the extent that you can, share this information with friends and family. Demystify our election system as much as possible. The amount of ads and the amount of propaganda is intended to terrify you, to make you feel small, to make you feel like you don't have any power. This is a bunch of rich people and their dumb games. These are mind games that they're playing on the TV. We can defeat that.